Further, we noted from the existing literature in Alaska that country foods were superior on many different levels for local inhabitants. So to give you a sense of the environmental factors and cultural factors here, you have Inuit, Athabascan, Aleut, Tlingit, and other Alaska Native peoples. This is about 150,000 people in a state population of about 686,000 at the time. A lot of the areas within Alaska, many of this so-called bush Alaska, you have only accessible potentially once a year via barge, which is shipments of fuel. Once the fuel comes in, the fuel price is set for the year. Essentially no roads that are connecting up these communities with urban Alaska as a whole. The villages itself are between around 50 to 6,000 people. About 51% of the population of Alaska lives in cities. Most of those are in Anchorage itself. Ann Finnip Reardon's talked about Anchorage as the largest Alaska Native village in Alaska as a whole. There's a wide variety of foods that individuals rely on. These are often called country foods, from terrestrial mammals all the way to waterfowl and associated fish resources and whaling as well. This varies quite a bit depending on season as well as annual flexibility. There are patterns of sharing, reciprocity, and trading that become incredibly important through various potlatching activities. Indeed, harvest of whales goes to members of the community as a whole. And the other thing to keep in mind here is the first trading posts out that were created in Alaska were really looked at as a guard or a protection against hunger and allowed for food security of peoples in times when there was regional variation that really changed the food security status of individuals. Store-bought food has been thought about as an imperfect alternative. First, it leads to a decreased self-reliance as well as control over local resources in terms of food availability, nutritional quality, safety, relevance in terms of cultural continuity. And then you also, with this, don't really see any sort of interaction with a particular product that's being consumed. A lot of this, at the time, there might be some involvement with tastes, with marketing, but the notion of how the food is produced is not really left too much in the hands of consumers. We'll also see an increased health vulnerability and risk that's associated with store-bought foods, and long-term health risks as well. Type 2 diabetes is becoming more prevalent amongst Alaska Natives, for example. We also see notions of cultural fragmentation as people spend less time on the land, less time with elders and informal education, and destabilization of historical and traditional roles and responsibilities along lines of gender and age. And then along with this, with these informal educational opportunities or non-institutionalized opportunities for education, in traditional ecological knowledge, we see language loss occur as well. So in context, we see weekly food costs are 2 to 3 times that in urban Alaska, Fairbanks, and Anchorage, with expenses of being over $200 a week for a family of 4. And it's important to note, too, that urban Alaska already has 25% higher food costs than national averages as a whole. 1 in 5 families live well below the poverty level with per capita income around $12,000. So this is often concentrated in rural areas. The differences are sometimes made up by federal transfer payments, Social Security, and other mechanisms, potentially at the tribal level. And it's important to keep in mind here definitions of poverty versus local perceptions of poverty, particularly when one has ready access to traditional food resources, such as fish and game in rural Alaska. We see in Alaska, too, that for store-bought foods, many individuals will fly into Fairbanks, Anchorage, or Juneau, conduct massive quantities of shopping. Alaska Airlines has allowed 3 checked bags within the state up to 50 pounds. So on one trip, one could conceivably get around 175 to 200 pounds worth of food. Um, Food shipping with postal bypass. Um, there's been much talk in Alaska too about the Postal Service subsidizing a lot of the shipping to rural communities in Alaska overall. Here you can see the figure here in terms of what stays local in terms of monies and income, and then the high cost of fuel, which of course is one of the large ironies in Alaska, is being a large producer of, oil, mostly for export and refining elsewhere. So the food cost comparison, again, we see cost comparisons across the board here. The weekly food cost rises fairly dramatically from Fairbanks to Barrow. And you can see from 122 up to $320, with per capita income being slightly modified for a cost of living allowance. But 250% increase from Fairbanks to Barrow, for example. And again, the heating oil comes into play here too, as that increases in price overall. So when we were thinking about this research, we met with members of the Community Food Bank, and they noticed that there was a shortage that was occurring with overall donations, and there was a lot of concern that people would be moving from rural areas in Alaska to more urban areas in Alaska. And part of this came to a head in late 2008 with the call for help from a Monic. And there were a number of responses that occurred both at the state level as well as non-governmental level with trying to provide assistance not only to Amonic but Western Alaska and communities in rural Alaska as a whole. We were interested in studying the food system in Fairbanks and particularly food assistance. I worked with students in my economic anthropology class and political anthropology class to look at food assistance in Fairbanks. And we noticed how food assistance circulated. Fairbanks is an interesting place. They've got about 100 different donors of food assistance. This goes to the food bank for general distribution. It's first collected there and then distributed to churches, to the Fairbanks Native Association, and these volunteers would then not only distribute the food in these locations, but also would sort the food and hand this out, drive it out to the various dispersal locations. There would be a free box where people would be able to pick and choose through what had been provided. Fairbanks Community Food Bank was also really good at looking at people's food preferences and putting different things in the boxes depending on individuals' food preferences. There were a lot of efforts made not to waste any of the food that was available, but the system didn't always work perfectly. There were issues about people who thought they were on the list, who showed up, who ended up not being on the list, who had to come back a few hours later in order to get the food that they had wanted. But there was a real concern about not wasting any of this food that had been given. And a lot of this, too, was from grocery stores that were, it was on the more marginal end of things in terms of expiration dates as a whole. There were some critiques of food assistance that overall in Fairbanks there was not enough traditional or country food systems, that it was difficult to navigate the systems, that there were too much of certain foods and not enough of other foods, and that you needed a justification after 4 boxes. The Fairbanks Community Food Bank was part of a social support system that included the rescue mission for individuals without a home. And so these people who were homeless ended up being able to eat at this location as well as sleep. But there was lots of concern about things like having to attend a service in order to get a meal, that if individuals were not sober, they would not be allowed into the shelter, and that those with a prior criminal record would not be allowed in. And there's been a lot of concern in Fairbanks, of course, with limiting people access to shelter in an urban environment. Well, we got through with this study and we were thinking about the overall distribution of food in Fairbanks and who had access to that overall, including food assistance programs. And this is within the context of food deserts. Food deserts have been conceptualized in the literature as access to grocery stores, but we also, and others have thought about what other types of things might come into play here. And then also what's actually meant by access, by foot, by car, by public transit, and then how far does it have to be in terms of from home or from work. So the real question that we were thinking about too was a lot of the literature deals with access to grocery stores. But Anthony Winston's study in Canada shows that grocery stores are sites or locations of high amounts of pseudo foods. These are foods which are very rich in terms of calories, but relatively poor in terms of nutrients overall. And Winston frames this in the context of political economy, where you have high profit margin goods that have essentially more shelf space that are dedicated to them. He also notes that they're not evenly distributed, where those regions with higher incomes tend to have a wider variety and cheaper selection of fresh fruits, fresh fruit overall, compared to a concentration of pseudo foods in other areas. The cost of food becomes important too in meeting caloric needs of individuals. To meet caloric needs of individuals, shopping could be anywhere between to $3.52 versus non-pseudo foods with high nutrient loads up to $36. So economics plays a role in making this and in helping people make decisions overall. Other studies have included Lane's work on food deserts, and this is in Syracuse, New York, and he looks at the presence or absence of supermarket in relation to the sale of lottery tickets, intrauterine growth restriction, known to cause low birth weight. And he looks at this in the context, the authors look at this in the context of structural violence and environmental risk versus the narrative of individual responsibility. And so they draw a half-mile radius around each supermarket and look at whether the tracks intersect or not. Those with no supermarkets are 3 1/3 times more likely to have unexplained IUGR. He notes that people of color comprise 3 times the proportion of residents in these high-risk areas, and the choice is limited by the social context in which choices are made. So the closing of supermarkets, as well as the absence of central city, is an example of structural violence in the context of Syracuse, New York. And he notes that public policy action should place high priority on supporting the opening of supermarkets in at-risk neighborhoods. So we think about this in the context of a place like Fairbanks, Alaska. And here you can see the Fairbanks North Star Borough, which has a population of about 100,000. About 30,000 of those people are in the 33,000 are in the city of Fairbanks itself, which is rather dense, industrial, post-industrial. Really boomed at the time of the oil pipeline, and there's been talk of reviving this with the development of the gas pipeline in Fairbanks. So you have a core downtown area, University of Alaska Fairbanks here, the airport, and then the military base, Fort Wainwright, and then out towards North Pole. So we were interested in Alaska in particular with the notion of subsistence resources. And Rob Bowman at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, an archaeology student, mapped out the subsistence resources that were available in the region. We considered that these should potentially be included in an analysis of food security and food deserts overall. And so we produced a number of different maps looking at food deserts with the traditional grocery stores as the measure of whether one is in a food desert or not. And we looked at this with half-mile buffers around bus routes, as well as walking to individual grocery store locations. From there, we added in alternative food institutions, which includes the community garden, the rescue mission, the farmers markets, as well as CSA drop-off locations. And then overall, we conducted a map where we overlaid everything in terms of the subsistence resources along with this to point to the one area in Fairbanks that has the lowest accessibility of food overall. Now we assumed overall too that there weren't any state or federal regulations which would prevent access to subsistence resources, and quite frankly that was not the case. Another study that was conducted was looking at alternative food movements in Fairbanks. There are a number of these. We focused on community-supported agriculture and looked at 6 different CSAs in Fairbanks, Alaska.